Good day. In this video, I'd like to share with you a number of popular interviewing advice that you should be skeptical of. Okay, the first one I'd like to share with you would be not to pause before answering interview questions. And on the reasoning that if you pause for too long, your behavior might come across as unnatural and you might be labeled as a cheater in job interviews. Okay, in my experience, this is terrible interviewing advice, and what I would advise you instead would be to pause intentionally in order to find the best possible story you want to share with them. Because what happens in job interviews, the problem is not that candidates cannot find answers to interview questions, but rather they give their second or their third best stories. Okay, so longest I've heard was a candidate who paused for 15 minutes for a technical interview, but generally speaking, you can pause for as long as 20 or 30 seconds, even in behavioral interviews. Okay. The second piece of advice I'd like to share with you would be on the topic of asking your recruiters and your main point of contact for insight into the interview process. You know, things such as what would be some questions to expect on whether your interview will be technical or behavioral and stuff like that. In my experience, pushing your interviewer for insight or for details rarely ends well. Okay, most classic example, your interviewer tells you, don't worry, it's going to be 100% technical, your interview, and it's going to be like 100% behavioral instead. Okay, or questions to expect, they might Google and send you a list that you already knew about, right? What I would recommend is to understand, your position in the process, to understand that there's not much that makes you special as a candidate, so there's not much reason for them to share insight in the process, even if they have it. Okay, so, still you can communicate with them and you can ask them totally plausible questions, but pushing for insight rarely ends well. Okay. The third thing I'd like to share with you here is that if you cannot pass a job interview on your own, you don't deserve the job. So if you cannot prepare by yourself without external help, you don't deserve the job. This is also terrible advice, and let me just start by saying that I receive plenty more thank you notes from YouTube and for people who use my free advice, from people who prepare on their own their job interviews, than from my paid services, and I'm super thankful for that. However, in my experience, and I do this for around 7 years, I have countless examples of people who use my services repeatedly. Okay, so for example, I had someone in 2019 whom I helped extensively with interview coaching and training, and they landed from Oracle to then Facebook, right? And last year they used my services again, this time to transition from Meta to NVIDIA. Not because they couldn't interview well, but they said, hey, you know what, why wouldn't I take advantage to polish up my interviewing skills as quickly as possible, right? And there's also another scenario where people, yes, you may pass your interview on your own, but if you get some help, you might perform even better and even negotiate a superior job offer in the process. So there's plenty of scenarios, and you should never be afraid to seek help in the process. Some people do it just because they don't have the time to prepare on their own, right? So it's a perfectly plausible scenario, right? Next point number 4 here. Point number 4 refers to an interviewing technique that's a relatively common one, that to try to interview in such a way to speak on a personal level and try to make the interviewer your friend. Okay, I'm quite skeptical of this approach to be efficient, especially for final interview rounds. Okay, you may be successful with this with a recruiter, for instance. You might speak on a more personal level where your emotional intelligence, your ability to read the room and stuff like that, your soft skills, so to speak, will be tested. But I believe it's a particularly dangerous approach to befriend your interviewer and to try to win them over this way on a personal level in job interviews.
which in my experience is a professional experience, right? It should be a formal experience, and I always advise people not to open up too much in job interviews on a reasoning that there's no such thing as the perfect candidate, in the same way there's no such thing as a perfect job, right? So trying to speak on a personal level, try to win over your interviewer by making them your friend, in my opinion, it's a very dangerous interviewing technique, and I do not recommend it. Okay, and the fifth thing I like to talk about here would be on the topic of taking advice from AI. And to give an example, I asked ChatGPT what are top 10 worst interviewing advice, and one of them was to give long answers in job interviews. In fact, I do recommend, and in my experience, my best performers are people who can speak on their strength at length and to make sense at length, right? But ChatGPT advised exactly the opposite. This is terrible interviewing advice because you're going to be rambling and whatnot. Now, what you should understand is that I challenged ChatGPT's reasoning on this, and I actually managed to convince ChatGPT that yes, there's even people who can do this well, and it agreed on this reasoning once I challenged it. Okay, so my recommendation would be to understand, the limitations of AI, and to understand, you cannot expect the AI to lead your interview prep and to give you advanced insight into how to pass interviews with high-performing companies, because what it does was to index a lot of sources which were cut off a long time ago, like 1 year ago, to take all that interviewing advice and pick what's the most interesting stuff for you. And you should pay particular attention, and what actually matters in these job interviews is a lot about your critical thinking and your ability to think on your feet during these job interviews, which ultimately makes you land these jobs. Okay, so I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.